My name is Howard Goldsmith, and I was a camper at Camp Shady Trails in 1968 and 1969. I was a counselor here in 71 and 72, and then I was a speech intern in 1973. My stuttering problem was on the moderate side. Over the course of the summer, my fluency improved, and I went back to high school, 12th grade in high school, and I decided to take a public speaking class. I remember one of my speech therapists, I believe his name was Mr. Dennehy, came to my class at Southfield High School for one of my public speaking assignments, and it was sort of later in the school year, and my speech had been slipping by then, and he was very encouraging, very nice of him to come to the class. I went back to Shady Trails after I graduated high school. Before I entered my freshman year, I went to Western Michigan University. And I, once again, I achieved pretty good fluency over the course of the summer. I had decided by this time to major in speech pathology and audiology there. I went back to Camp Shady Trails the summers of 71 and 72 as a counselor. I worked with the younger campers. I graduated Western in 1973, and I was a speech intern here in the summer of 73. This was summer before I got my master's degree at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and it was a very good experience. I worked largely with stuttering adolescents, and it was all in all a very positive experience for me. Went to school in Madison. I graduated in December of '74. I was fortunate to get a job in Ottawa, Ontario, at a brand new children's hospital. Met my wife up there, and 4 years later, we moved out to Seattle, and I started a PhD program at the University of Washington. The person that was my advisor was also the director of Camp Shady Trails for several years. His name was David Prinz. Eventually got my PhD, and I took a position at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and I was there for 4 years. I left the field. I joined my father in a family business in the Detroit area, and I've been at it ever since. So.
I'm Bud Oxley. I'm from Fremont, Ohio. I've spent about 5 summers here at Shady Trails. I was a camper here in 1963 and 1964, those summers. And those were the days of John Clancy. And then I came back as a counselor in 1968, 70, and 71. One of the years I worked for Dave Prinz, and the other 2 I worked for Dave Fields. And this camp has a very special place in my heart. I was a stutterer. I still am. And that was one thing that they always tried to tell you when you were here, that you're always going to be a stutterer, but you just learn to sort of control your speech. And they certainly taught me the tools and the techniques of doing it. At the beginning, it was very difficult to stand up in the dining room and speak, etc. But I think basically there was a little bit of a divine intervention there, and it sort of interceded and sort of got me through some of those round robins, etc. In my career, I was a self-employed optometrist in Northwest Ohio, just a small town, Fremont, with a population of about 16,000. And it turned out to be a job where basically I talked all day. And I've often thought of that through those 40 years. If it wouldn't have been for Shady Trails, I would have never been able to do that type of a career. This is a very moving place for me. Sometimes I get a little bit on the emotional side, but today, when I drove down that hill, I came off at 22 North, and I was driving down that hill, all these memories back in the 60s and stuff, they all came back, and it was something, and it just like, it seemed that it was yesterday, and it's been now basically 45, in other words, almost 50 years. It's a wonderful thing to be back here. I'm still alive at age 71, and those years roll by, but seeing some of the old people that I worked for instance, Ash Bishop, who was wonderful as a boss. He was the athletic director on the first year that I was here in '68, and he was wonderful. And so was Tim Carter. He was my boss then in '70 and '71, and I was down in the cave my last 2 years, and then in '68 I was a counselor in the Wolverines. It was a wonderful run, and I'm sad to see that it is no longer a camp for kids with speech problems, because I see children out there today with speech problems, and I guess now it's basically at a different level. I guess we're at a different era of our life, but I guess that's life. So,
my name is Frank Polson. I'm from around Saginaw, Michigan. I was at Shady Trails as a camper after my freshman and sophomore years in high school. That would have been 1963 and 64 respectively. And I was on the camp staff in 1969 after graduating from Central Michigan University as an intern, and then I returned as a senior clinician 1970, 71, 72, and 73. As a camper, I was in the Wolverine cabin for those 2 years, and then on the staff, I was on the Wolverine cabin as an intern, and then worked in the neophyte cabin, the cave, and the university club for 2 years as a senior clinician. Shady Trails is as close to hallowed ground for me as I think there is. Just to think about the impact of just this place. I am a retired speech and language pathologist, having worked 42 years in Saginaw, and I don't think I would have been exposed to speech and language pathology had I not stuttered as a kid. And then it looked like the people working with me were having way too much fun, and so then I pursued this as a career. When we came to camp, everything we had was supposed to be labeled, and my mom sent off someplace, I think, with a camp referral to get labels that said Frank Polson, and then she sewed those into my socks, my t-shirt, my underwear, all of my clothes. Well, living in the neophyte cabin or the Wolverine cabin, we'd walk down this path to the lodge for our meals. And during this period of time, there was an athletic supporter, a jockstrap, that somehow appeared on this path. Well, you know, nobody really wanted to pick this thing up, and we kind of just looked at it and scoffed about, you know, someone lost this and they're going to have to sing, because to retrieve it, you had to sing during announcements. Somebody would find your article, and to get it back, you had to sing a song. And part of all this was to help people keep track of their stuff, so you didn't have personal objects littered around the camp. Well, I was one of the guys that saw that jock strap and just didn't give it any more thought. Well, come to find out, it was my own. And it was days this thing was on here, and finally somebody picked it up, brought it into the dining hall, and after meals during announcements, they held up this jock strap and said, "This belongs to Frank Poles, and it has his name in there." I was mortified, totally mortified. But I remember singing, "It's an itsy bitsy teeny weeny yellow polka dot bikini," to get the jockstrap back.
My name is David Field. I was here in 1964 as an associate therapist, as a student associate from the University of Michigan. I came back as a major therapist in the Wolverines and the Cave. I was the assistant director under Dave Prinz and wound up being the director for 5 years. Many of my most favorite stories come from my intern year because I was young and foolish, and the whole camp experience was quite overwhelming. You soon learned after you got here that Mr. Clancy expected nothing but 120% of your effort. That often meant that you were up very late at night in the staff room, preparing lessons, keeping the camper diaries that you were required to do, and other types of things to get ready for the next day. So one night I was there quite late, and anybody that knows what northern Michigan nights are like outside the city knows it gets quite dark. So I turned out the lights. I was the last one out of the staff room. I had forgotten my flashlight, and I turned out the lights, and it was dark. It was really dark. So I made my way to the neophyte cabin, which was where I was. Thankfully, it was the first cabin. And I did so, I knew which direction it was in, and it was a foggy night. There was fog rolling up, and you could hear the boo of the big foghorn from down in Northport. And I walked to the cabin with my hands out like this, feeling for trees. Well, unfortunately, there was one tree that was narrower than my hands, and I slammed right in this tree, knocked me down, and when I got up, I knew my nose was bleeding. I mean, it was really bleeding badly. So I got to the cabin and felt my way around to the front door, and it was locked. I found out later that on this foggy, scary night, Pete and Rich, who were the counselors, had told the kids stories of the swamp monster that crawls up from the bay on foggy nights, and that the foghorn was the sound of the swamp monster coming to the camp. So they went to bed, and of course, being dead tired like all other staff members, they went right to sleep, but the kids locked the door. So I made my way around to this counselor's room, and I pounded on the window, and I couldn't get anybody up. So I went to the back door, and it was locked, so I started pounding on the back door. The door opened, the light went on, and one of the little kids stood there looking at this man who was full of blood. And he screamed and ran, but at least I got in the cabin. I was in the cabin. So I woke Rich up and I said, "Rich, I'm having a little problem here." So he sees all this blood and he helps me stop the bleeding, change my shirt, went to bed. Well, I got up the next morning and I had 2 black eyes, the start of 2 black eyes. So I did my therapy and I was sitting on the patio drinking coffee, and Mr. Clancy comes up and says, "What happened to you?" So I briefly told him the story that I had been up late in the staff office and I ran into the trees and bumped my nose and was bleeding. And I expected him to say, "Oh, I'm so sorry." What he said was, he patted my knee and said, "Good for you." "You were up working late. Good for you," and walked away. And that's one of my many, many stories of my first year and my experiences with John N. Clancy.
Hi, I'm Carol Berenson. I was Carol Garthy, and I worked in the kitchen in 1969 to the early 70s. And we worked with Ruthie Flees, and she was kind of the sergeant of the boot camp of the kitchen. And she kept discipline and kept a lot of the good food coming. I think that everybody truly enjoyed the meals that she put together. She fed a lot of people day after day and gave them great food. And we girls served at the window, and the campers would come and have to speak to us and relay what they wanted, and we had to patiently wait for them. Sometimes it was a little longer than others, but they eventually got things out, and we figured out what they wanted, and so we kept the meals running, and we were kind of a rowdy bunch in the back. I think we tried hard to not disrupt meal times with our rowdiness in the back, but sometimes it flowed over into the dining room.
Hello, my name's Diana Morgan Carter. I married the athletic director. But when I first came to Camp Shady Trails, I drove down that hill and I thought, what have I gotten myself into? All the cabins were gray because that was the paint that Dr. Clancy got for the cabins. And then I was greeted by an adult staff member who was stuttering like crazy. And I thought, uh-oh, this little girl from Ohio has made a big mistake. Now, if you're wondering why I have my hat on, I want to tell you that I had many hats at Shady Trails. I started as an intern, learning under fabulous people with a fabulous counselor in the Park Avenue. I graduated to the Roost, where I was a major clinician for a couple of years, and then I became the director of the entire junior division. But the problem that you have when you work with the little people is that when you do a Miffler, which is a play, most of our kids couldn't read very much. And a lot of our kids, besides being disfluent, you couldn't hardly understand, which is why their parents sent them to us. So thinking about the Miffler, it was really hard to decide which hat I was going to wear. You see, with little kids, we had to design a program that nobody had to be able to read. This is my Southern hat, that the kids, just our disfluent kids, could probably read. And we had to design a Miffler with very few words. So we had a Miffler to beat all Mifflers. You see, we designed a Miffler that had hardly any words, but had capes and masks, and we flicked the lights, and our kids came out with, we had great big signs, pow, bam, all those one words that our kids could say clearly. Have fun. They would pretend they were fighting. They had a blast. Costuming was simple for us because our kids couldn't fit into those. And we really wanted superheroes. We didn't want any girl costumes on those boys. So hats and masks became very important. And also feathers would fly off because we would have seagull feathers flying over the curtain. But I want to tell you something. Everything we did at Shady Trails had a purpose. The round robins, the speeches, the announcements, and the Mifflers, which were the plays, had a special purpose. It's that these children were never chosen to be in a play. They didn't have that opportunity. So now, not only were they going to be in a play, but everybody was going to be in the play. And so that's where we had to design something very clever. But something magical happened after that Miffler. All of our kids were congratulating each other and hugging each other because they were the heroes. And nobody could take away that experience from them. And that's from the Park Avenue and the Roost. We loved Camp Shady Trails. And I want to close with one story. When I was in the Roost, I had a little boy from a wonderful family. He was disfluent, but he wouldn't change his shirt. He would always wear the shirt that he wore when he first came to camp. And so I took Steve out on the patio after everybody left and said, Steve, you know what? Your mom and dad loved you so much that they decided to lend you to us so that we could help you with your speech. And how hard that is as a parent, and I know it's hard for you as a camper. And so the next day, when Steve came to breakfast, he wore his Camp Shady Trails t-shirt and turned out to be the best athlete in the junior division. So I say Camp Shady Trails was magical. We used speech in all different ways, but many of the things that we did changed the hearts and minds of those children. If you've ever seen a smile on somebody's face who was never chosen, who never got the opportunity to do anything, that was our blessing. So to everyone we say, hats off to thee.
Hi, my name is Cedric Jimison, and I was at camper. 79 I was at Park Avenue, and in 80 I was at the Wolverine. So it was like more like a tall and tale story because both cabins are different animals. Park Avenue was mostly like always battling against the youth club, whether it's in reading a story to get points, or the digging contest. But the Wolverines, it seems like help us to grow up a little bit more because we become younger men than we were back in Park Avenue. So I'll never forget that one time that when I was at Park Avenue, that we learned about how to keep our room clean. Because if we don't keep our room clean, something usually happens. And one day I woke up the next morning, it was a camper that was sleeping across the hall from my room. I was on the top bunk as well. So when I saw his bed, I saw a big orange stick made out of fiberglass that has feathers, almost like an Indian would use. And it was inserted on his bed. So everybody was frantic, more likely thinking there was Indian joke that came. Because one had feathers on his top bed, and they said I had a feather too, but I guess that means you have to be clean. If not, you're going to get a visit from Indian Joe. When people making the fire, the counselors, they're making a fire to make her feel welcome. We're singing a lot of songs too. Like I like Jacob Hannah Smith. I remember that one. Of course, besides the Shady Trail, Welcome to Shady Trail, but. And then I remember Little Bunny Foo Foo. That was one of the songs we used to sing too. So it's nothing better than having a even playing field. It's not like when you're at a regular school, you get picked on, about 8 months a year, like 180 days of school year. And then you go to camp for maybe about 42 days, you had a lot of fun. This camp is really almost like a second home. But I know it's a long drive, but I really enjoyed it. I really had a great break this time around.
My name is Dan Dustin. I began my work at Shady Trails in 1973 as a counselor in the Wolverines. I returned in 1974 as a counselor in the Cave. And then I skipped a year, and then in 1976 I came back to serve as the program director for the camp. We used to call the program director the athletic director, but we changed a lot of what we did at camp and moving sort of away from traditional sports skill instruction to new games and other kinds of activities that were less competitive, rewarding involvement, participation. And we did that in part because the camper population was changing. It was changing from a camp for boys who stuttered to a camp that had a variety of speech and language disorders that were more representative of what was going on in society at large. So we had to change the recreation programming to accommodate that kind of change in campers. So it was my privilege to serve here from 76 through 79. Then I went away for a couple of years, came back one final year in 1982. My career has taken somewhat of a different path. I'm a professor of outdoor recreation studies at the University of Utah. Much of my early work actually developed from my stay at Camp Shady Trails. The first publication I ever had in my life was with then director David Daly in the Therapeutic Recreation Journal, where we published an article about the camp. I took the camp experiences and sort of brought them to the larger organized camping community. In 1989, I gave the closing keynote address at the American Camp Association Congress in Seattle, Washington, to about 1,200 people. It's the best talk I've ever given. It's the best received talk I've ever had, and it's because I actually knew what I was talking about. And what I was talking about was my experience at the University of Michigan Speech and Hearing Camp. I made a boatload of friends at this camp, many of whom I continue to be friends with some 45, 50 years later. Today at this reunion, I gave my round robin that I still remember after 45 years verbatim. So that suggests some sort of lasting value in my head, or some sort of disorder of my own. But that was neat. I've probably published 8 or 9 articles in various journals about this camp. So I've made it work for me in my academic life. I brought several students to this camp to work as counselors from San Diego State University in the mid-1970s and early 1980s. So it's played a really big part, especially in my early professional development. It's interesting to me that now, 43 years later, I've published a dozen books and about 250 journal articles now, and it's just neat to think that my very first publication came with Dr. Daly, who was a director of the camp in 1973. So I believe in the value of organized camping. I believe in the idea that there is something magic that happens when you bring adults and children together in a natural environment for 8 weeks. I think the universe takes on a life of its own each summer. The rest of the world disappears, and I think that's really what makes it special.
Hi, I'm Bob Voorhees. I was a camper in 1959 and 1965, and I came back as a counselor of the Mariner Cabin in 1970. Stories of the many romances and subsequent marriages that were actually kindled by mutual Shady Trails experiences. And in 1970, I met my future wife, Marie Carlson, who was one of Ruth Flea's kitchen girls. At the end of every meal, after the kitchen girls had served and cleaned up the dishes, there are these doors here for the cabinets that slide down. So the next thing you know, even though at this moment we're wide out open with the rest of the main lodge, when those doors slide down, this becomes a very private area. And I was so smitten with my future wife Marie that I snuck back. This was at lunch or breakfast, and she was in here working hard, and I had to steal a kiss from her on this very spot back in 1970.
My name is Sue Bishop.
I'm Ash Bishop.
I came here as Sue Morgan, and this was my first position in teaching. I was in charge of about 10 or 11 deaf and hard of hearing boys, and I certainly learned a lot, it being my first step into that career. But probably more importantly than that, I met Ash, and after a few short weeks we became engaged, and in September of that same year we were married. So we're celebrating 50 wonderful years this fall.
Yeah. And I was from San Diego. Sue was from Hammond, Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
We met here in 1968, and we were married in 1968. I was here from 1965 through 1970, Wolverine Cabin for 3 years, and then athletic director for 3 years. Dave Prinz hired both of us,
Yes.
and so we were
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Gloria.
the most wonderful memories you could possibly have. I think we would have worked here for free.
Yeah.
It was just that kind of an environment. The kids that made such progress, we grew so much, and we have friends from those days that are still our friends today. So very special experiences, a very special camp, Shady Trails Camp.